Welcome to Clandestine Cases, Sherlock Holmes, and the Mystery of the Moonlit Watchtower, Chapter 1. The impossible crime. It is often said that no man is ever truly prepared for what the night may bring. And as I sit by my study window, pen in hand, I cannot help but reflect upon one of the most baffling cases ever to cross the threshold of 221B Baker Street. One that tested even the razor-sharp intellect of Sherlock Holmes to its very limit. It began, as so many of our adventures did, with an unexpected knock at the door. But before I recount that fateful visit, I must first describe the strange circumstances that had, for a full day prior, seized the attention of all of London. The morning papers were filled with lurid headlines. Murder in the Watchtower, a crime that defies explanation. Scotland Yard baffled by locked room killing. And the more sensationalist Evening Star cried, Ghost of Blackridge Manor strikes again. The location of the tragedy, Blackridge Manor, an ancient estate perched upon the cliffs of Kent, was a place already steeped in legend. Its looming watchtower, built centuries before as a defense against marauders, had been the scene of this unspeakable crime. The victim, Sir Reginald Ferraux, a retired magistrate of formidable reputation, was found dead within the watchtower's upper chamber, stabbed cleanly through the heart. And yet, the room in which his body lay was locked from the inside. Its only window barred and untouched, the heavy oak door bolted so firmly that it had to be forced open by the butler and constable together. What had most confounded the police, and the public alike, was not merely the impossibility of the locked room, but the manner in which Sir Reginald was found. According to multiple witnesses, he had retired alone to the watchtower shortly before midnight, carrying with him a lantern and a sealed envelope that he refused to open until the stroke of 12. By dawn, he was discovered sprawled lifeless beside his chair, the envelope now missing, and a silver pocket watch smashed at his feet, its hands frozen at 12:15. No weapon was discovered, and no footprints marred the dust of the narrow stone staircase leading to the tower, save for Sir Reginald's own. Rumours swirled like smoke through the village of Blackridge. Some whispered of vengeful spirits, others of secret passages and ancient curses. The Yard, for its part, had dispatched Inspector Lestrade, though I knew well enough that when Lestrade's name appeared in a case described as unsolvable, this matter would soon make its way to Baker Street. Indeed, I had scarcely folded away my newspaper when the sharp rap upon the door echoed through our lodgings, followed by Mrs. Hudson's measured steps to announce a visitor. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she called, a note of concern in her voice. "Inspector Lestrade is here to see you. Says it's urgent." Holmes, who had been languidly lounging in his chair, eyes half closed in contemplation, sat up at once, the glint of anticipation already alight in his sharp gaze. "Ah, Lestrade, no doubt about Blackridge Manor," Holmes murmured, rising as the inspector entered, his usually composed features drawn and pale. "Gentlemen," Lestrade began, wasting no time with pleasantries, "this is no ordinary murder. If ever there was a case for your peculiar talents, Holmes, this is it." Holmes motioned for him to sit, steepling his long fingers as he regarded the inspector intently. "Tell me everything, Lestrade," he said quietly. "Every detail, no matter how seemingly trivial. For it is often in the smallest things that the truth lies concealed." And so began our plunge into one of the darkest and most perplexing enigmas of our time. A mystery in which shadows, both human and spectral, would entwine themselves around a solitary tower, a shattered watch, and a murder that should never have been possible. As Lestrade spoke, the room seemed to grow colder, as though the very chill of that lonely tower had crept in with him. And in that moment, as Holmes leaned forward to listen, I could not help but feel that we were standing on the threshold of something far more sinister than either of us had yet imagined. Little did I know that by the time this case reached its grim conclusion, we would uncover secrets long buried and a motive more twisted than I could ever foresee. Chapter 2: Holmes and Watson's First Discussion. No sooner had Lestrade finished recounting the grim scene at Blackridge Manor than Holmes rose from his chair with a sudden burst of energy, pacing before the fireplace, with hands clasped tightly behind his back. His brow furrowed in deep concentration. "You say, Lestrade," Holmes began, his voice calm but incisive, "that Sir Reginald was discovered within a room bolted from the inside, his body stabbed, yet with no weapon to be found." "That's correct, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade confirmed, tugging absently at his cuffs. "Not a trace of the knife, or whatever it was that killed him, and no way in or out. It's as though the devil himself struck him down and vanished into thin air." Holmes paused, glancing sharply at Lestrade. The devil, Inspector, seldom leaves such tantalizing riddles without a human hand guiding his mischief. I could not help but interject. "But, Holmes, if there were neither footprints nor signs of forced entry, and with the door and window secured, how could anyone have possibly reached him?" "Ah, Watson," Holmes said, turning to me with a faint smile, "you touch upon the very heart of the matter, and it is a question we must answer before all others." Lestrade sighed heavily. "The local constable swears there's no hidden passage in that tower, and believe me, we looked. Every stone in that blasted wall was tapped." Holmes raised a finger. Yes, I am sure you did. Though often people search only for what they expect to find. Tell me, Lestrade, this smashed watch, at what time did the coroner estimate Sir Reginald's death?" Lestrade rubbed his chin. "Hard to say precisely, but between midnight and 1. The watch was found broken, hands frozen at 12:15, and the sealed envelope that Sir Reginald carried up with him vanished, you say?" Holmes asked keenly. "Gone," Lestrade confirmed, "though Lady Ferraro, his wife, insists she saw him with it earlier that evening. He told her it contained the answer to everything, though what he meant by that no one knows." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden intensity. "Curious. A message intended to be read, but never delivered. Perhaps stolen, perhaps destroyed. Either way, it is a clue of the highest significance." He turned to me. "Watson, you recall my monograph on cryptic communications. A sealed envelope, a broken watch, and a locked room. There is a story here, my friend, and we are but on the first page." "Holmes," I said carefully, "do you suspect this is more than a straightforward murder?" You hinted at something deeper when Lestrade first arrived. Holmes's gaze lingered on the fire, shadows dancing across his sharp features. "Straightforward? Hardly. A man like Sir Reginald, with a spotless reputation, few known enemies, and a sharp mind, does not simply fall victim to an ordinary villain. No, Watson, This crime reeks of calculation. Lestrade leaned forward, clearly growing uneasy. There's something else, Holmes, though I can't make head nor tail of it. Holmes raised a brow. Go on. Sir Reginald was heard speaking to someone. In the tower, Lestrade admitted, glancing between us. Also claims the gardener's son, young Thomas. He swears he heard voices, 2 of them, around midnight. But when he looked up, the only light he saw was from Sir Reginald's lantern, flickering through the tower slit. A second voice, I asked, intrigued. But if the door was locked and no one found within, then... Precisely, Holmes said with quiet satisfaction. Either young Thomas was mistaken, or we are faced with an adversary of rare ingenuity. Holmes turned sharply toward the inspector. Lestrade, I will accompany you to Blackridge Manor on the evening train. Watson, I should be glad of your company, as ever. Of course, Holmes, I said without hesitation, already reaching for my notebook. Lestrade exhaled with something like relief. I'm glad to hear it. Frankly, Holmes, we've never had a case like this one. The local papers are already conjuring up tales of ghosts and curses. I'd rather give them something more substantial to write about. Holmes smiled thinly. You may rest assured, Lestrade, that I have never yet met a ghost that could lock a door from the inside and vanish through solid stone. No, the answer lies in human hands and human cunning. The challenge will be to see what others have missed. One more thing, Mr. Holmes, Lestrade added as he rose to leave. Sir Reginald's wife, Lady Ferraro, she's not well. The shock of it all has unnerved her, but there's something odd about her manner. Detached, almost cold, and she was the last to see him alive. Holmes's eyes darkened slightly, but he said nothing. Once Lestrade had gone, Holmes stood gazing out into the foggy street, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin. Watson, he said softly, there are forces moving in the shadow of Blackridge Manor. Forces unseen but not unfelt. Before this case is over, we may find ourselves staring into a darkness deeper than mere murder. I said nothing, for I knew Holmes well enough to recognize that when he spoke thus, danger was never far away. Thus, by that evening, our course was set. The train to Kent awaited, and so did a mystery that would test Holmes's powers of deduction to their very limit. Chapter 3. The First Clues, a Scene of Deception. The following evening found Holmes and me rattling through the countryside aboard a swift train bound for Kent. The wind hissed against the windows, and the gloom of the waning daylight gave the landscape an eerie, shifting appearance. Holmes sat silently opposite me, his sharp eyes half closed, fingertips pressed together in that familiar attitude of intense concentration. When we arrived at Blackridge Manor, the shadows of dusk had fully descended, and the towering silhouette of the watchtower loomed above us, its narrow windows like blind eyes peering out into the night. The house itself was a grand but somber place, its once proud facade now made grim by tragedy. Lestrade met us at the door, his manner tense. Glad you've come, Holmes. They've kept everything as it was. The room, the tower, even the grounds. Nothing touched. Holmes gave a slight nod. Good. Now, let us proceed without delay. Take us to the scene. We ascended a narrow staircase leading up to the ancient stone tower, our steps echoing heavily in the confined space. The air grew colder as we climbed, and the flickering lantern in Lestrade's hand cast long shadows upon the walls. The chamber in which Sir Reginald had been found was small and circular, its single narrow window overlooking the moonlit grounds far below. The heavy oak door, now unbolted, creaked as Lestrade pushed it open. Holmes entered first, his gaze sweeping the room with almost predatory intensity. The room was sparsely furnished. A wooden writing desk, a leather chair beside a dying fire, and a small side table upon which sat an empty glass and a decanter of brandy. A large oil lamp, now extinguished, stood near the chair. But the true focus of the room was, of course, the chalk outline on the rug, where Sir Reginald had fallen. Holmes knelt beside the outline, examining it carefully. "No bloodstains," he murmured. "None that we could find," Lestrade confirmed. "But the wound, straight through the heart. Doctor said death was instantaneous." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A single, precise thrust. Interesting. Where is the watch?" Lestrade pointed to a side table where a shattered silver watch lay. Its glass was broken, the hands frozen at midnight. Holmes picked it up delicately, turning it over in his gloved hands. A fine piece, Swiss-made, expensive, but not ostentatious. He examined the crack in the glass minutely. "Notice, Watson, the manner of the break. A sudden impact, perhaps dropped in struggle or upon death." Holmes next moved to the window, peering out into the night. The moon, now partially obscured by clouds, cast an otherworldly glow over the grounds. "A long drop to the garden below," Holmes murmured, running his fingers over the window frame. "And yet, Lestrade, you are certain this window was secured?" "Bolted from the inside," Lestrade replied firmly. "Just as we found it." Holmes nodded but said nothing. He moved to the door, examining the bolt. "And the door, also locked from within when you forced entry?" "Yes, we had to break it down." Holmes hummed thoughtfully, his fingers lingering on a faint scratch near the doorframe. He said nothing, but I saw his eyes narrow. As Holmes surveyed the scene, I took the opportunity to observe Lady Ferraro, who had quietly entered and now stood in the doorway. She was a striking woman, tall and composed, but her pale face and hollow eyes betrayed an inner turmoil. Holmes turned to her suddenly, his gaze piercing. "Lady Ferraro, may I trouble you for a moment?" She started slightly, as though pulled from dark reverie. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. Forgive my bluntness, but when you last saw Sir Reginald, did he mention why he was retiring to this tower, alone, at such an hour?" Her fingers tightened on her handkerchief. "He said there was something he must examine, something in that envelope. He didn't wish to be disturbed." "And what of this envelope? Do you know what it contained?" She shook her head. "He would not say. But he seemed agitated, Mr. Holmes, more than I had ever seen him before." Holmes watched her for a long moment, then said gently, "Did Sir Reginald ever complain of enemies? Anyone who might wish him harm?" For a fleeting instant, something, fear perhaps, flashed in her eyes. But then she composed herself. "No, none that I know of. He was respected by all." Holmes inclined his head politely. "Thank you, Lady Ferraro. You have been most helpful." As she turned to leave, Holmes watched her carefully. The moment she was gone, he turned sharply to Lestrade. "Inspector, who else resides in this house?" Lestrade ticked them off on his fingers. "Lady Ferro, of course. The housekeeper, Mrs. Crowthorne, a sharp old bird. There's Sir Reginald's nephew, Mr. Lionel Ferro. He's here from London. Something about business matters. And Dr. Alcott, the local physician, who was a close friend of Sir Reginald's. Finally, the gardener and his son, though they live in a small cottage on the grounds. Quite a gathering," Holmes murmured. He walked to the hearth and studied the ashes in the grate. With a pair of tongs, he carefully lifted a half-burned scrap of paper. Holding it to the lantern light, he frowned in concentration. "Anything?" I asked, leaning closer. Holmes shook his head. "Too charred to read, but undoubtedly a letter or document. Perhaps part of what Sir Reginald was examining before he died. And yet, why destroy only part of it?" Holmes stood suddenly. "Watson, note this carefully. A man retires to a locked room, carrying an envelope that he claims holds the key to everything. Minutes later, he is dead, stabbed. The envelope is missing. There are no signs of entry or exit. The window is secured, the door locked, and yet someone was here." He turned to Lestrade, eyes glinting. "Inspector, there is a deception here, artfully concealed. But every deception leaves a trace. Our task will be to uncover it." At that moment, a sound reached us. Soft, distant but distinct. The mournful toll of the old watchtower bell, swaying gently in the wind. Holmes glanced sharply toward the window, then back at us. "Come, Watson, let us see what the night air and a walk around the tower may reveal. There is more to this than meets the eye." And with that, he strode from the room, his keen gaze alight with the first spark of discovery. Chapter 4. The gathering of suspects. Holmes and I returned to the grand drawing-room of Blackridge Manor, where the household had assembled under Lestrade's direction. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls and illuminating the anxious faces gathered around the room. Holmes stood near the fireplace, his sharp gaze moving from one figure to the next with quiet intensity. I took my usual place slightly behind him, notebook in hand, watching as the drama unfolded. Lady Ferro sat stiffly in a high-backed chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her expression a careful mask of composure. The dim light only emphasized the weariness etched upon her fine features. At the far end of the room, Lionel Ferro, Sir Reginald's nephew, lounged with an air of forced nonchalance. He was a man of perhaps 35, fashionably dressed, but with a sallow complexion and restless eyes that belied his outward calm. A half-empty glass of brandy trembled slightly in his hand. Mrs. Crowthorne, the housekeeper, stood primly near the doorway, her sharp eyes darting between the others. There was something of the hawk in her thin, angular face, and I could not help but think she had observed more than she let on. Dr. Alcott, a heavy-set man with a florid complexion and greying whiskers, sat near the hearth, fidgeting with his watch chain and casting furtive glances at Holmes. His manner was one of ill-concealed anxiety. Finally, in the corner near the window, stood Gregory Holt, the gardener's son, a wiry youth with a nervous air. His cap was crumpled in his hands, and he stared at the floor, avoiding everyone's gaze. Holmes cleared his throat softly, and all eyes turned to him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but commanding, "you are all aware of the tragic event that has befallen this household. I am here to uncover the truth behind Sir Reginald Ferrars's death. To do so, I shall require your full candor. Rest assured, anything concealed will come to light, for there are no secrets that cannot be uncovered when one knows where to look." A tense silence followed his words. Holmes's eyes first settled on Lionel Ferrars. "Mr. Ferrars, I understand you arrived at Blackridge Manor but 2 days before your uncle's death." Lionel shifted uneasily. "Yes, that's correct. I came to discuss some financial matters with my uncle." "Financial matters," Holmes echoed smoothly. "May I ask if those were resolved to your satisfaction?" Lionel hesitated, his fingers tightening around his glass. "We had not yet come to an agreement. My uncle was a difficult man, very particular about his estate." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Indeed. And where were you, Mr. Ferrars, when the tragedy occurred?" "I was in my room, reading." Lionel's tone was defensive, and Holmes noted it with an unreadable expression. Turning slightly, Holmes addressed Dr. Alcott. "Doctor, you were a close friend of Sir Reginald." "Yes, Mr. Holmes, for many years," Alcott replied, his voice a bit too quick, as though eager to establish his innocence. "I dined with him earlier that evening, but I left shortly thereafter. He seemed troubled, but he would not say why." "Troubled, you say?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Can you elaborate?" Alcott hesitated. It was unlike him, but he appeared preoccupied, distracted even. Holmes gave a faint nod, then turned his attention to Mrs. Crowthorne. "And you, madam, you've served this household for some time." "For 20 years, sir," she said crisply, "and I knew Sir Reginald as well as anyone." Her sharp eyes glinted. He had been agitated lately. Kept himself shut up in that tower, reading old letters and papers. Wouldn't say a word about them. "Old letters?" Holmes repeated softly, as though filing away the information. "And where were you when Sir Reginald was killed?" "In my room, Mr. Holmes. I was asleep, though I was awakened when the commotion began." Holmes turned lastly to Gregory Holt. "And you, young man?" Gregory looked up quickly, pale and nervous. I was in the garden shed, sir, fixing the hedge clippers. Didn't hear a thing till Mrs. Crowthorne came shouting." Holmes observed him silently for a moment. "Tell me, do you often work so late?" Gregory swallowed. "Sometimes, sir. Sir Reginald liked things tidy, even at night. Said the moonlight showed the weeds." Holmes's eyes narrowed ever so slightly at that curious remark, but he moved on without comment. "Interesting, very interesting." With the initial questions concluded, Holmes paced slowly before the fire, his gaze distant yet alert. "It is clear to me," Holmes began, "that Sir Reginald was engaged with something of great personal significance on the night of his death. Something connected to old letters, perhaps, or some private matter he had kept hidden." He glanced at Lady Ferrars, whose face remained carefully composed. "The question we must answer," Holmes continued, "is who among you had cause to fear what Sir Reginald might have revealed? Or perhaps who stood to gain from his silence?" A ripple of unease passed through the room. And there is one other matter, Holmes added softly, his eyes glinting. Who had access to that tower, despite the locked door and bolted window? No one answered. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. Holmes turned suddenly to Lestrade. Inspector, we shall require a full account of everyone's movements that night, as well as any papers belonging to Sir Reginald, particularly those recently burned or otherwise destroyed. Also, I should like to speak privately with the staff and review the grounds, including the tower's exterior. As you wish, Holmes, Lestrade said, scribbling notes furiously. Holmes turned back to the assembled group. Thank you. That will be all for now. But rest assured, I shall have further questions, and I will uncover the truth. With that, he strode from the room, his coat swirling behind him. I followed, noting the troubled glances exchanged between those left behind. As we reached the corridor, Holmes turned to me, his eyes sharp. Watson, he murmured, this case is like a locked puzzle box, but every lock has a key. The question is, who holds it? Chapter 5. First Suspects. The Red Herring. The following morning dawned cold and grey, a mist hanging low over the moors that encircled Blackridge Manor like silent sentinels. Holmes was already at work when I awoke, bent over a series of papers spread across the small writing desk in our guest room, a cup of tea steaming nearby, untouched. "Ah, Watson," he said without glancing up. "Excellent timing. I have been reviewing what little information we gathered last evening. But already, certain patterns begin to emerge, though much remains clouded in shadow." Before I could inquire further, a sharp knock at the door announced Inspector Lestrade. He entered with the briskness of a man convinced that resolution was within his grasp. "Holmes," Lestrade said, "I believe we have our man." Holmes arched a brow. "Indeed, Inspector, you have arrived at a conclusion overnight. Commendable speed." Lestrade straightened proudly. "Lionel Ferro, of course. The nephew. Motive, means, and opportunity. He stands to inherit the estate. He quarrelled with Sir Reginald over money. Everyone in the house knows that. And he has no alibi." Holmes folded his hands, watching Lestrade with an expression that suggested amusement more than admiration. "Interesting," he murmured. "Pray, tell me how you reached this conclusion." Lestrade, encouraged, stepped forward. "It's simple, really. Lionel Ferro came here seeking financial assistance, which Sir Reginald refused. Heated words were exchanged, heard by the housekeeper herself. Later that night, Sir Reginald is found dead, the tower locked from the inside. But what if the door was locked after the crime and the window bolted as part of a clever ruse? Who better than the heir to mastermind such a thing?" Holmes nodded slightly, as though pondering the idea. "And you are satisfied this explains all?" Lestrade looked puzzled but firm. "Well, yes. The motive is as clear as daylight." Holmes rose, adjusting his cuffs. "Come, Watson. Let us take a morning stroll, perhaps among the gardens. I find that fresh air aids fresh thinking. You are welcome to join us, Inspector, though I suspect you may prefer to prepare the arrest warrant." Lestrade blinked at Holmes's tone, unsure whether to take offence or to follow. "Well, perhaps I shall walk with you after all," he muttered, falling into step as we descended the grand staircase and emerged onto the mist-laden grounds. As we walked, Holmes's sharp eyes roved over the gardens and up to the looming watchtower. "It is always instructive, Watson," he said quietly, "to examine not only what is present, but what is absent. Notice, for example, the absence of footprints along the gravel path leading to the tower. Despite the dampness of the night, I followed his gaze. Indeed, the path was undisturbed, the morning dew unbroken save for our own steps. But Holmes, I said, surely Sir Reginald used that path. Holmes smiled faintly. Perhaps, or perhaps he was not the only one who used it, and someone has taken care to erase their trace. Lestrade, overhearing, frowned. But surely, Holmes, the matter is simpler than that. Lionel had both reason and opportunity. Ah, but reason is not always what it appears, Inspector, Holmes murmured. And as for opportunity, let us consider that more carefully. Holmes suddenly turned back toward the house. Come, let us pay Mr. Lionel Ferro a visit. I wish to test a small theory. We found Lionel in the study, seated by the fire with yet another glass of brandy, though the hour was still early. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. Mr. Ferro, Holmes began, taking a seat opposite him, I wonder if you might clarify one or two small matters. Lionel looked up warily. If I can. You had a disagreement with your uncle over money, did you not? Lionel's jaw tightened. Yes, he refused to help me. But that doesn't make me a murderer. Holmes inclined his head slightly. And where were you precisely between the hours of 11 and midnight? Lionel hesitated, glancing between Holmes and Lestrade. In my room, reading. I already told the inspector. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Indeed, but what were you reading? There was a pause, too long for comfort. An old novel. I am not sure which one. Something from my uncle's library. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but penetrating. And yet, there are no books out of place in the library, Mr. Ferro. I checked it myself this morning. Lionel flushed. Perhaps I left it in my room, I don't recall. Holmes rose smoothly, his eyes never leaving Lionel. Thank you, Mr. Ferro. That is all for now. As we left the room, Lestrade was already smirking. You see, Holmes, he's lying through his teeth. Holmes only smiled as we reached the hallway. Perhaps, or perhaps he is merely concealing something less sinister than murder. We shall see. We paused near the stairwell as Mrs. Crowthorne passed by, her arms full of linens. Holmes halted her gently. Mrs. Crowthorne, a word if you please. Did you happen to see Mr. Ferro that evening, after the argument? She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the linens. I may have, in the corridor. He seemed agitated, but he went straight back to his room, I believe. Holmes inclined his head, watching her carefully. Thank you, madam. You've been most helpful. As she moved on, I turned to Holmes. Surely, Holmes, this points to Lionel Ferro. He had motive, and clearly his alibi is weak. Holmes smiled, thinly. Ah, Watson, how often have I said, the most obvious suspect is often the least likely. Lionel Ferro is precisely who we are meant to suspect. But the truth, my dear friend, is rarely so obliging. He gestured toward the tower, half shrouded in fog. No, Watson, there is something deeper here, something that has yet to reveal itself. And until it does, we must tread carefully. As we turned back toward the house, I could not shake the feeling that though Lestrade had his suspect, Holmes was chasing something far more elusive, hidden in the shadows of that ancient watchtower, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 6. The Secret. Clue. A hidden inconsistency. It was well into the afternoon when Holmes and I found ourselves once more in the drawing-room, seated near the fire that had, despite its warmth, failed to lift the chill that had settled over Blackridge Manor. Outside, the mist had thickened into a dense shroud, muffling every sound and casting ghostly shapes across the window panes. Holmes stood before the hearth, pipe in hand but unlit, staring into the embers as though they contained some hidden message only he could decipher. I observed him in silence, knowing from long experience that to disturb his train of thought at such moments would be futile. At length he turned to me, his grey eyes sharp and contemplative. "Watson," he began, "have you ever considered how dangerous it is to accept facts as they are presented, without testing them against logic and observation?" "I suppose I have," I replied cautiously. "Though I must confess, Holmes, that in this case the facts seem rather straightforward. The young Mr. Ferro has both cause and opportunity, and his behavior has been undeniably suspicious." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Exactly, my dear Watson. Suspiciously too suspicious." Before I could reply, he strode across the room to the writing desk where he had placed a small bundle wrapped in linen. With a flourish, he unwrapped it to reveal a peculiar object. A delicate silver watch, cracked across its face, its hands frozen at a precise moment. 11:47. I rose from my chair, peering over his shoulder. "Where did you find that?" "In Sir Reginald's study, hidden behind a row of dusty ledgers," Holmes said quietly. It had fallen into the narrow gap between the desk and the wall. I very much doubt anyone else knew it was there. I frowned, but what does it signify? Holmes turned the watch over carefully in his gloved hands. "It signifies, Watson, that Sir Reginald was in possession of this watch at the time of the crime, and that something occurred to cause it to break and stop at precisely 13 minutes to midnight. I considered this. But if the body was discovered shortly after midnight, does that not confirm the approximate time of death?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Ah, but here is where the inconsistency lies, Watson. You see, according to the medical examination, brief though it was, the time of death is estimated around 10:30, and yet we have a watch stopped nearly an hour later. What, then, are we to make of that?" The implications of his words struck me like a bolt. "You mean someone tampered with the scene? Someone moved the body?" "Precisely." Holmes leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Someone wished to disguise the true time of death, perhaps to ensure that their own movements would appear innocent, when in truth they were anything but." I felt a growing unease. But why go to such elaborate lengths? And who would know enough to attempt such a deception? Holmes smiled thinly. "That, my dear Watson, is what we must discover." He placed the watch carefully back into its linen wrap. "There is something else, another detail, subtle but telling. When I examined the tower room this morning, I noticed faint traces on the stone floor near the window, scuff marks that suggest something heavy was dragged, not simply fallen where it lay." "The body?" I asked aghast. Holmes nodded. "Indeed, And if that is so, then Sir Reginald did not die where we found him. He was moved, perhaps by someone attempting to stage the scene as a suicide or a locked room puzzle. But why? To mislead the police? Possibly, Holmes said, pacing now. Or perhaps to hide the true nature of his death, whether accidental or deliberate. And there is yet another small point. The window, Watson. You recall it was bolted from within? Of course. Holmes turned sharply. And yet there was moisture on the inside sill, mist and dew. If the window had remained closed all night, how did that happen? No, Watson. I suspect that window was opened and closed again. After the crime, sat heavily in my chair, my mind whirling with the revelations. Holmes, this changes everything. If the scene was staged, Lionel Ferro may indeed be innocent. Holmes inclined his head. Or he may be involved in some way yet unclear. But what is certain, Watson, is that the explanation offered thus far is false. And falsehood, as you well know, is the surest sign we are being deliberately misled. At that moment, a sharp knock at the door interrupted our thoughts. Mrs. Crowthorne entered, her face pale, hands twisting in her apron. "Beg pardon, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, but I thought you should know. Miss Clara Ferro, has taken to her room, and she won't answer the door. She's most distressed." Holmes's eyes narrowed, though his voice remained gentle. "Thank you, Mrs. Crowthorne. We shall speak with her shortly." The housekeeper withdrew, leaving us once again in the dimly lit room. "Watson," Holmes said softly, "it appears the shadows are beginning to stir. First Lionel's evasions, and now Clara's distress. The question is, what are they hiding? And how much of this strange play is yet to be revealed?" I met his gaze, feeling the weight of the mystery pressing upon us. "What will you do now, Holmes?" He smiled, but it was a smile without mirth. "Now, my dear friend, we begin to pull at the loose threads and see what unravels." Woman's quarters was situated on the eastern side of the manor, overlooking the fog-wreathed marshes beyond the gardens. A dreary sight, I thought, as we ascended the creaking staircase, one that could not help but weigh heavily on a mind already strained with grief and fear. Holmes knocked softly at the door, but there came no reply. "Miss Ferro," he called, in a gentle but firm tone. "It is Sherlock Holmes. I believe you would be wise to speak with me." Still silence greeted us. Holmes turned the knob, but the door was locked from within. Without missing a beat, he produced a slender tool from his coat pocket, one I had seen him employ on many occasions to great effect. In moments the lock yielded, and the door swung inward with a faint groan. What we beheld within gave me pause. Clara Ferro sat at her writing desk, her face pale and drawn, her hands resting motionless on a sealed envelope before her. Her eyes, hollow and rimmed with sleeplessness, lifted slowly to meet ours. A single candle flickered beside her, casting long wavering shadows that danced like spectres across the walls. Holmes stepped forward, his gaze keen but not unkind. "Miss Ferro," he said, "forgive the intrusion, but I believe you are in danger, and there are truths that must be known if we are to prevent further tragedy." Clara's lips trembled. "Danger?" she echoed faintly. "It's too late for that, Mr. Holmes." Holmes tilted his head slightly. Too late. Why do you say so? She hesitated, glancing at the envelope as though it contained all the burdens of her soul. At last, she whispered, because they'll never let the truth be known. Because Sir Reginald wasn't meant to die. Not like that. My pulse quickened. Then you know something of what happened that night. Clara pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. I know enough, she murmured, enough to fear for my life. Holmes knelt beside her chair, his voice soft. Miss Farrow, I cannot help you unless you trust me. Who do you fear? Tears welled in her eyes. Everyone, she whispered, everyone in this house. Before Holmes could press her further, a commotion from below shattered the tense quiet. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs, followed by a sharp rap at the door. Holmes, it was Inspector Lestrade, sounding unusually agitated. You'd best come down at once. There's been another incident. Holmes straightened immediately, and Clara's face turned white as chalk. Another incident? I asked, exchanging a grim glance with Holmes. What on earth has happened now? Lestrade, panting slightly, pushed open the door, glancing uneasily at Clara before addressing Holmes. It's the butler, Simmons, found unconscious in the library. Looks like someone struck him from behind. And, Holmes, something was taken. Holmes' eyes darkened. Taken? What? A letter, Lestrade said. An important one. Sir Reginald's solicitor arrived this afternoon. Apparently, Sir Reginald had been preparing to change his will. Simmons was tasked with delivering the solicitor's letter to the study, but now it's gone. Vanished. A sharp intake of breath from Clara drew all our attention. She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. The will, she breathed. Then it's true. He meant to disinherit. Holmes stepped closer. Disinherit whom, Miss Farrow? She shook her head, her eyes brimming with terror. I cannot say. Holmes's voice was calm, but insistent. Miss Farrow, if Sir Reginald intended to change his will, that would certainly give someone motive for murder, and perhaps for striking Simmons to conceal it. Clara rose unsteadily, clasping her hands together. You don't understand, Mr. Holmes. It's not just about the inheritance. It's about something much darker. Darker, I repeated, unsettled by her tone. She nodded, her gaze distant. There were things Sir Reginald knew, things about this family, secrets that should never have come to light. And now they'll do anything to keep them buried. Holmes's eyes glittered with sudden intensity. What secrets? But before Clara could answer, another cry echoed up from the hall. A maid's shrill scream of terror. Holmes spun on his heel. Stay here, he instructed Clara firmly. Watson, Lestrade, with me. We hurried down the stairs 2 at a time, following the sound of the maid's sobs to the library. There, under the dim glow of a single lamp, Simmons lay sprawled on the floor, a trickle of blood staining his temple. He was breathing, but shallowly and clearly dazed. A pile of scattered papers and open drawers showed signs of a frantic search. Lestrade crouched to examine the butler, while Holmes circled the room, his sharp gaze missing nothing. It was someone who knew exactly what they wanted, Holmes murmured. They went straight for Sir Reginald's desk and nothing else. I watched him move, noting how his eyes lingered on a nearby window. one that stood slightly ajar. "Someone left in a hurry," Holmes said, gesturing to the window. "And in doing so, they may have left behind more than they intended." Reached for a slip of paper caught in the sill, a torn scrap as though ripped from a larger document. Holding it up to the light, he studied it intently. I stepped closer, peering at the words scrawled in a hurried hand. "Cannot allow this to proceed. If the truth is revealed, it will ruin us all. Must act before nightfall." Holmes folded the slip carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "it appears this case has taken a most dangerous turn." Lestrade, rising from Simmons's side, asked, "What now, Holmes?" Holmes's face was grim. "Now, Inspector, we find out who would risk everything to stop Sir Reginald's intentions. And why." Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. Later that evening, as the moon climbed higher, casting its pale glow over the marshlands, Holmes sat in the drawing room, a contemplative expression upon his features. The household had been unsettled since the attack on Simmons, and a tense silence had fallen over Ferro Manor. I, too, sat nearby, nursing a glass of brandy, watching Holmes as he tapped his fingers thoughtfully against the arm of the chair. Length, he rose and addressed me, his sharp eyes gleaming with purpose. "Watson," he said quietly, "it is time we provoke the truth from hiding." I arched a brow. "Provoke? And how do you propose to do that?" A faint smile touched Holmes's lips. "By giving our shadowy adversary reason to act, reason to fear that their carefully laid deceptions are on the verge of exposure." Before I could inquire further, footsteps sounded in the corridor, and Inspector Lestrade appeared, followed by none other than Mr. Edwin Hartwell, Sir Reginald's cousin, and Miss Lydia Ferro, Sir Reginald's sister, both looking pale and strained. Holmes greeted them cordially, but with a glint in his eyes that told me he was already working toward some unseen goal. "I've asked you here," Holmes began smoothly, "because I believe we are closer to solving the matter of Sir Reginald's death than some might wish." Hartwell stiffened. "Have you now, Mr. Holmes? And what might you have discovered?" Holmes studied him keenly before replying. "Oh, several things, most notably that Sir Reginald intended to make a significant change to his will. A change that would have dramatically affected the fortunes of those gathered under this roof." At that, Lydia's eyes widened, and she clasped her hands tightly, together. "A change to his will? I had no idea." "Indeed," Holmes mused, watching her closely, "and yet you were seen leaving his study late in the evening on the night of his death." Lydia faltered. I merely wished to speak to him about a personal matter." Holmes smiled thinly. "Of course, personal matters are so often tangled with financial ones in families such as yours." Hartwell gave a harsh laugh. "If you're implying that Lydia or I had anything to gain from my cousin's death, sir, you're mistaken. Reginald had no reason to cut me from the will." Kommt den Sherwitz. Eyes glittered. Did he not? And yet, I understand Sir Reginald had recently been made aware of certain irregularities in the estate accounts. Irregularities that might have raised uncomfortable questions. Hartwell's face flushed. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Holmes." Holmes held up a hand. "Merely an observation, Mr. Hartwell. But perhaps you would care to explain the rather large withdrawal made from Sir Reginald's private funds 3 days before his death. A sum that, curiously, is unaccounted for." A heavy silence followed. Hartwell shifted uneasily, but said nothing. Holmes let the tension linger before turning to Lestrade. "Inspector," Holmes said casually, "I presume you still have the items we recovered from Simmons' quarters earlier." Lestrade, catching Holmes's meaning, nodded. "Yes, indeed." At this, both Lydia and Hartwell looked sharply at Holmes. "And what items are those?" Lydia asked, her voice a little too calm. Holmes smiled faintly. "A mere handful of letters, correspondence between Simmons and an unnamed party. Letters which strongly suggest that Simmons was blackmailing someone within this house." A gasp escaped Lydia, while Hartwell's hands clenched at his sides. Holmes moved closer to them, his gaze piercing. "You see, it seems Sir Reginald had learned of Simmons's schemes, and perhaps of others' secrets as well. Secrets that someone was desperate to keep buried." There was a long pause before Hartwell sneered. "And you expect us to believe that Simmons was blackmailing Reginald himself? That hardly seems credible." Holmes's smile widened slightly. "Who said it was Sir Reginald he was blackmailing?" Hartwell's jaw tightened, and he looked away. Holmes, satisfied that his words had sown the seeds of unease, turned back to Lestrade and me. "Well, Inspector Doctor, it has been a long day, but I believe tomorrow will bring new revelations." He moved toward the door. Lydia's voice called out, strained and anxious, "Mr. Holmes, do you truly believe the murderer is among us?" Holmes paused and turned, his eyes cold and sharp. "Miss Farrow, I believe the person responsible walks these halls even now, and that they know I am close to uncovering them." With that, he left the room, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. Once we were in the corridor, I touched his arm. "Holmes," I whispered, "was any of that about Simmons's letters true?" He gave a quiet laugh. "Partially, Watson. Simmons did have a secret, but whether it relates to the murder or to other unsavory dealings remains to be seen." "Then why say so much in front of them?" Holmes's eyes gleamed as he glanced back toward the drawing room. "Because the guilty party now knows I am watching. And if I am right, they will be driven to make a fatal mistake before long." Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The following morning dawned grey and heavy with mist. The thick fog rolled across the moors and coiled about the crumbling stones of Farrow Manor, casting long, distorted shadows, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Holmes and I had barely finished breakfast when a frantic pounding came at the door. Inspector Lestrade burst in, his usually composed face pale and drawn. "Holmes, Dr. Watson, you'd best come quickly. There's been another attack." Holmes was already on his feet, his sharp gaze snapping to attention. "Where?" "In the watchtower," Lestrade said grimly. "Come now, there's not a moment to lose." We hurried through the fog-laden grounds, following the path toward the ancient tower. As we neared it, I could see a small group gathered outside, their faces pale, whispering fearfully among themselves. Inside, Simmons lay unconscious on the floor, a deep gash across his temple. Blood stained the stones beneath him, and the shattered remains of a lantern lay scattered nearby. Holmes knelt beside Simmons, examining the wound. Still breathing, he murmured, "The blow was meant to incapacitate, not kill, though perhaps the assailant was interrupted." I glanced around uneasily. Who found him? Mrs. Hewitt, her apron stained and her hands trembling, stepped forward. "I did, Doctor. I was bringing him some broth, and there he was, on the ground like that." Holmes stood surveying the scene, his eyes sharp as razors. "Notice, Watson, that Simmons's pockets have been turned out. Someone searched him after attacking him." Lestrade scowled. "Looking for those letters you mentioned, Holmes?" Holmes nodded slightly, though I sensed he had more in mind than he was letting on. Perhaps, or perhaps something even more damning. Lestrade looked around the narrow chamber, his brow furrowed. No sign of forced entry, and I had a constable posted outside the manor all night. Holmes moved to the narrow staircase that wound up to the tower's upper level. "Then, our culprit is no stranger to these walls. They know the secret ways of this house." He turned to Mrs. Hewitt. "Tell me, madam, are there passages or hidden doors in this tower?" The housekeeper's eyes darted nervously. Well, there's an old stair in the wall that leads down to the wine cellars. But it's been sealed for years, or so we thought." Holmes' eyes gleamed. Sealed to the eye, perhaps, but I doubt to determined hands. He turned to Lestrade. "Have a constable stationed at this tower from now on, day and night. No one goes in or out without my leave." "Right you are, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade agreed, signaling to one of his men. Holmes knelt beside Simmons again, studying his face. Poor devil knew something, and someone was desperate enough to risk everything to silence him. Straightening, he turned to us. "Come, Watson. We must examine the route between here and the manor. And if I am correct, we may find traces of our ghostly opponent's flight." As we left the tower and walked slowly back toward the manor, Holmes's eyes scanned the ground, every tuft of grass and muddy footprint. The fog clung thick around us, muting the world into a grey blur. Suddenly, Holmes stopped, crouching low. "Here," he murmured, gesturing to a faint mark in the soft earth. A partial boot print, narrow and elegant, unlike Simmons' worn work shoes. "Our phantom signature." I leaned closer. "You think this is our attackers?" Holmes gave a small smile. "Undoubtedly. And note the direction. It leads away from the tower, not toward the house, but towards the old family crypt." "The crypt," I echoed, a chill passing over me. What business would anyone have there? Holmes was already moving. That, Watson, is what we shall soon discover. Within minutes we stood before the entrance to the crypt, its stone door heavy with age. Holmes pressed a hand to its surface, examining the edges. "Recently disturbed," he observed. "See how the moss has been brushed away here and the dirt, unsettled along the threshold." Lestrade approached, frowning. "But who would go in there?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he produced a small lantern and pushed the door open, revealing the cold, dark interior beyond. Someone hiding, a secret inspector, and one they would kill to protect. We stepped inside, the air thick with the damp chill of the tomb. Holmes's lantern cast flickering light on the stone coffins and faded carvings along the walls. Near the far end of the crypt, Holmes stopped abruptly, kneeling to examine something. "What is it?" I asked, peering over his shoulder. Holmes picked up a fragment of paper, torn and water-stained, yet still legible in part. Scrawled across it in a shaky hand were the words, "If you ever reveal what you know about the night of the Watchtower, I will see to it that you share the same fate as—" The rest was torn away. Holmes turned to us, his face grim. So, Simmons was being warned, threatened even. And now, someone has made good on that warning. Lestrade's eyes widened. Then, there is a conspiracy here. Holmes straightened, folding the paper carefully. There is, Inspector, and it runs deeper than any of us first imagined. But they've made a mistake. In striking too soon, they've shown their hand. And now we are closer than ever to unmasking them. As we exited the crypt, I could not shake the feeling that we were walking closer to a shadow that might strike again, before Holmes had the chance to reveal their identity. Holmes, however, seemed utterly calm, as though he had already foreseen the next move. Chapter 10. The True Motive. Begins to surface. The events of the morning had cast a shadow over Farrow Manor. News of the attack on Simmons spread quickly, and a tense unease settled over the household like a gathering storm. Though Simmons was carried to his quarters and attended to by Watson, he remained unconscious, leaving his secrets still locked away. Holmes, however, was undeterred. After ensuring Simmons was under constant watch, he summoned Lestrade, Sir Reginald, Miss Emily, and Mr. Adrian Mallory into the drawing-room. A grim assembly under the sombre gaze of the ancestors whose portraits lined the walls. "Mr. Holmes," Sir Reginald began, the lines of worry etched deeply into his face. "Surely now you see the danger we are in. This business grows darker with each hour." Holmes stood by the hearth, one hand resting lightly on the mantel, eyes half-lidded in contemplation. "Indeed, Sir Reginald, the danger is most present, but so too is the truth, lurking just out of reach." Lestrade leaned forward. "But what's it all about, Holmes? This isn't some random act of violence. Someone wants to stop Simmons from talking. But what could he know that's worth attempted murder?" Holmes turned slowly, his sharp gaze settling on the group. "That is the question, Inspector, and to answer it, we must first understand what happened in that watchtower, long before poor Simmons was attacked." Miss Emily, seated near the window, clutched her hands tightly in her lap. "You believe this goes back to Father's death?" Holmes inclined his head. "I do. And more besides." Mallory, his usually smooth demeanor slightly frayed, frowned. "But that was deemed an accident. A fall. A tragic misstep. Nothing more." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Was it, Mr. Mallory? Or was it something more sinister? Something carefully staged to appear as mischance?" A murmur rippled through the room. Sir Reginald shook his head. "You are suggesting my brother was murdered? For what possible reason?" Holmes moved away from the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back as he paced thoughtfully. "Motive, Sir Reginald, is the linchpin of every crime. And I believe we are beginning to see its shape. Let us consider what we know. He paused before a table, laying out a series of notes and items he had gathered. The torn letter fragment from the crypt, a copy of Lord Ferro's will, and a rough sketch of the tower's layout. First, Holmes began, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. We know that Lord Ferro died suddenly, alone in the watchtower, shortly after speaking of a matter that greatly troubled him. Second, we know that Simmons, his trusted groundskeeper, possesses knowledge about that night, knowledge that nearly cost him his life. He held up the fragment of the letter. If you ever reveal what you know about the night of the watchtower, I will see to it that you share the same fate. It is a clear threat made by someone desperate to keep a secret buried. Lestrade nodded grimly. And now they've tried to make good on that threat. Holmes turned to Sir Reginald. May I ask, sir, who stood to gain from Lord Ferro's death? Reginald hesitated, his face pale. Well, I inherited the title and estate, of course, as his younger brother. But surely you don't suspect me. I suspect everyone until I have reason not to, Holmes said evenly. Though inheritance is a possible motive, there is something more, something far deeper and more urgent. Holmes walked to the window, gazing out into the swirling mist. Consider this. What if Lord Ferro had discovered a secret, one that could ruin someone in this house? Perhaps a betrayal, perhaps a crime long concealed. And what if he intended to expose it? Mallory frowned. What sort of secret? Holmes turned, his eyes gleaming. A secret that would upend everything. For example, a falsified will, or an illegitimate claim to the estate. A sharp intake of breath came from Emily, though she quickly masked it. Holmes noted this, but continued smoothly. Or perhaps blackmail. Perhaps someone sought to force Lord Ferro into silence, and when he refused, arranged his death to look accidental. Holmes then fixed his gaze on Emily. Miss Ferro, may I ask, was your father troubled in the days before his death? Did he confide in you? Emily swallowed, her hands twisting in her lap. He was uneasy. I heard him argue with someone in his study late one night, but when I asked, he wouldn't say what it was about. He only said, "Old sins have long shadows." Holmes's eyes sharpened. Interesting. And did you recognize the voice of the person he argued with? She hesitated, then shook her head. No, I couldn't say. Holmes did not press her, though I could see he had noted her hesitation keenly. Instead, he turned to Lestrade. Inspector, I shall need to see all the documents relating to Lord Ferro's estate, and his death before the day is out. And I would be obliged if you would keep a close watch on all the household members. We are nearing the heart of this mystery, and I would not have our quarry slip away now. Lestrade nodded. You'll have them, Holmes. As Holmes gathered his notes and prepared to leave the room, he cast one final glance at the assembled faces, now tense and pale. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we are on the verge of discovering not only who killed Lord Ferro, but why they would risk everything, even another murder, to keep their secret safe. But be warned, desperate hands may yet strike again, before the truth is known. With that, Holmes swept from the room, and I followed close behind, my mind racing with possibilities. Yet one thing was clear. The mystery that had seemed so tangled was beginning, under Holmes's relentless logic, to reveal the threads of a much darker design. Chapter 11. The Bait, Holmes's Grand Strategy. The hour was late when Holmes and I returned to our temporary quarters at the inn. The fog pressed against the window panes like a living thing, swirling under the pale glow of the moon. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated, pacing the room with sharp, deliberate steps, as though each movement helped turn the great gears of his mind. He finally paused by the hearth, where a small fire burned, and looked at me with that glint in his eyes I had come to recognize, a glint that meant the game was afoot. "Watson," he said quietly, "the time has come to force our opponent's hand." I sat forward, eager for any clue that would illuminate the path Holmes was pursuing. "You believe you know who it is, Holmes? The person behind Lord Ferro's death and the attack on Simmons?" Holmes gave a faint smile, steepling his fingers. "I believe I have discerned the pattern, my dear fellow. But as with any pattern, one must confirm that the threads indeed weave into the fabric one suspects, and to do that, we must set a snare, one subtle enough to avoid alarming our quarry, yet compelling enough to provoke action." He turned suddenly, reaching into his coat and retrieving a folded sheet of paper. The torn letter we had found earlier. Holding it up to the light, he studied it thoughtfully. "This letter is the key, Watson. Though incomplete, it implies that Simmons was blackmailed over something he witnessed, something connected to the night Lord Ferro died. But what could he have seen that would drive someone to murder?" I asked. Holmes gave me a sharp glance. "Consider what we have learned. A troubled Lord Ferro, secret arguments in the night, a will that benefited Sir Reginald, and now a violent attempt to silence Simmons. There is a secret at the heart of Ferro Manor. And it did not die with its master." He crossed to the window and gazed out into the mist. "No, Watson, it still lingers like a shadow, and I intend to bring it fully into the light." I stood, curiosity pressing me forward. "But how do you propose to do that?" Holmes turned back to me with a gleam of satisfaction. "By leveraging what our adversary fears most, exposure." He moved to the desk and swiftly wrote a note, pausing only to choose his words with surgical precision. I leaned closer to watch, reading as he wrote. "To whom it may concern, I have discovered certain truths about the night Lord Ferro perished. These truths, if made public, would ruin more than one reputation. Unless we meet to discuss this, I shall have no choice but to reveal what I know." A friend. When he finished, he folded the paper neatly. "This note, Watson, will be delivered anonymously to all of the principal parties, Sir Reginald, Miss Emily, and Mr. Mallory. It will imply that someone knows the truth and is prepared to act on it. But won't that simply alarm them?" I asked. "Precisely," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing with intent. "Fear is a great revealer, Watson. The innocent will be confused but unafraid. The guilty, however, will react. And I intend to be watching when they do." He rang for the innkeeper and gave him precise instructions for the delivery of the letters in the early morning, each to arrive as though slipped under the door by unseen hands. Once that was arranged, Holmes resumed his pacing, speaking more to himself than to me. "The question remains, what was the true relationship between Lord Ferro and the other inhabitants of that house. Something darker than mere family ties, I suspect. There are indications that Lord Ferro may have been on the verge of disinheriting someone. What if he discovered a forgery? Or an illegitimate heir? Or, Holmes paused, his brow furrowing. Or perhaps an old crime shared between two conspirators. I was beginning to see the scope of his vision. You believe Lord Ferro intended to expose them, and that's why he was silenced. Exactly. And Simmons may have seen something, or been told something, on the night of the Watchtower. Holmes sat down suddenly, resting his chin on his hands. There is more yet, Watson. Something still eludes me. The crypt, the torn letter, and above all the Watchtower itself. Why there? Why would anyone meet in that solitary place, rather than the house? He was silent for a moment, then looked up at me sharply. Tomorrow we shall return to the Watchtower, before anyone else has the chance to meddle. I want to examine it again, this time with a particular focus in mind. Before I could inquire further, there was a knock at the door, and Lestrade entered, holding a bundle of papers. As requested, Mr. Holmes, the estate documents, everything relating to Lord Ferro's will and property. Holmes took the bundle eagerly. Excellent, Inspector. You have my gratitude. Lestrade lingered, eyeing Holmes carefully. If you don't mind me asking, Holmes, what do you expect to find in all that? Holmes smiled faintly. Proof, Inspector. Proof of a motive that would justify 2 murders and perhaps more. As Lestrade left, Holmes began sifting through the papers with lightning speed, eyes flicking over each page. Watson, look here, murmured, holding up one document. A revised will, drafted mere days before Lord Ferro's death. And it names, he stopped, his eyes flashing with a sudden realization. Ah, now we see it. So that is the key. I leaned forward. What is it, Holmes? But he only smiled thinly. Patience, Watson. All will be revealed. But first, let us see how our little message rattles the serpent in its den. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. The morning dawned grey and sullen, the fog lingering like a heavy veil over the village of Ferro's Hollow. Holmes had scarcely slept. I knew this from the way he sat, unmoving and tense, by the window, his sharp eyes fixed on the road that led to Ferro Manor. Our anonymous letters had been delivered before dawn, and now Holmes was waiting, not merely for a reply, but for a reaction. "It will not be long now, Watson," he said quietly, still gazing out as if expecting the very mists to part and reveal the guilty. I poured him a cup of tea, but he ignored it, lost in thought. "What is it, Holmes? You seem as though you're on the verge of something." He turned to me then, and I saw that peculiar gleam in his eyes, the light that signaled his mind had reached a revelation. "I have been reviewing every element of this case in my mind, Watson, and there is something, a detail so subtle that it slipped past me until now. But when combined with the will we examined last night, it changes everything." I leaned forward, my curiosity sharpened. "What detail?" Holmes stood abruptly, moving to the table where he had laid out the estate documents alongside his own meticulous notes. With a finger, he tapped the revised will. "You recall, Watson, that this document cuts Sir Reginald out almost entirely in favor of Miss Emily?" "Yes," I nodded. "A striking change, given Sir Reginald's expectations." Holmes smiled coldly. Indeed, but what struck me was not merely who was favoured, but why. Lord Pharaoh's language. Did you notice? He wrote of correcting a long-standing injustice. I blinked. You think he was referring to something buried in the past, Watson. Something that would explain much. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Consider, Lord Pharaoh, known to be a stern and sometimes ruthless man, suddenly decides to amend his will and favour his ward over his own nephew. Why? Because he discovered that Emily is not merely a ward, but possibly his own daughter. I stared at Holmes, astonished, but there was no mention of that. Ish, not directly, Holmes agreed, but the wording is suggestive. And now consider this. What if Sir Reginald discovered the same truth? That he was to be cut out of the inheritance in favour of an illegitimate heir? Would that not give him ample motive to silence Lord Pharaoh before the new will could be made public? The logic struck me with force. By heavens, Holmes, that would explain the murder. But what of Simmons? Why attack him? Holmes's expression darkened. Because Simmons knew. He was a servant, yes, but one loyal to Lord Pharaoh. And I now suspect that Lord Pharaoh confided in him before his death. When Simmons began to hint at what he knew, our villain had no choice but to try and silence him. He began to pace the room. But there is more, Watson. The Watchtower, that lonely place. Why would Lord Pharaoh go there on the night of his death? Unless he was meeting someone to reveal the truth. And you think he met Sir Reginald there? Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing. It is one possibility, but there is another, darker possibility. He turned to me sharply. What if Lord Pharaoh had intended to make a confession of his own past misdeeds? What if someone else, someone even closer, stood to lose if the truth came out? Before I could answer, a knock sounded at the door. Lestrade entered, his face set in serious lines. Holmes, you were right. Something's happened. Holmes motioned for him to continue. Lestrade held out a small object wrapped in cloth. This was found near the watchtower this morning, half buried in the mud. He unwrapped it carefully to reveal a golden locket, tarnished but still bearing an intricate engraving. Holmes took it gently, studying it. A family crest, he murmured, turning it over. And inside? Lestrade opened the locket, too, revealed two miniature portraits. A much younger Lord Pharaoh and a woman I did not recognize. Holmes stared at the woman's face for a long moment. Then, softly, as though to himself, he said, "So that is where the line runs." I leaned over to see. "Who is she, Holmes?" Holmes closed the locket with a snap. "Watson, I believe we have just seen the face of Miss Emily's mother." Lestrade's eyes widened. "You think Lord Pharaoh had a secret affair?" "I think it is more than an affair," Holmes said coldly. "I think this locket was intended as a keepsake. Perhaps a promise never fulfilled. And if Lord Pharaoh was prepared to acknowledge Emily as his daughter, it would explain his sudden change of heart. But who would have known of this, and why leave the locket by the tower?" "Precisely, Lestrade," Holmes said. "Someone brought this locket to the tower that night. Perhaps to remind Lord Pharaoh of his secret, perhaps to blackmail him, or perhaps to confront him one final time." Holmes turned to me. It is becoming clear now, Watson. This is not merely a matter of inheritance. It is a matter of blood, of identity, and of long-concealed scandal. He paced back to the window, gazing out as if assembling all the pieces in his mind. Then he straightened, decisive. We must return to Ferro Manor. I believe it is time to confront Miss Emily. For if anyone holds the key to Lord Ferro's past, it is she. And Sir Reginald, I asked. Holmes's eyes glinted dangerously. He too will be present when I reveal what I know. I intend to see how both react to the truth. With that, Holmes reached for his coat, and I followed suit, heart pounding. For the first time since we had arrived in Ferro's Hollow, I felt as though we were on the very brink of discovery, as though Holmes had finally glimpsed the full design of the web in which all these lives had become entangled. As we stepped out into the swirling mist, Holmes turned to me and said quietly, "Prepare yourself, Watson. I believe we're about to see the mask fall from the true face of the murderer." Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. As Holmes and I strode through the morning mist back toward Ferro Manor, I could not help but feel the rising tension thick in the air. Holmes, though composed as ever, had an unusual tightness to his expression, as though he was prepared for a confrontation of the most delicate and dangerous sort. We arrived to find Miss Emily seated in the drawing-room, her pale, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Sir Reginald stood by the fireplace, feigning disinterest but darting sharp glances between us as we entered. Holmes bowed slightly, his gaze never leaving Emily. "Miss Ferro, Sir Reginald, thank you for receiving us. There are matters of grave importance that must be discussed, and they concern both of you intimately." Emily looked up, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Mr. Holmes, what do you mean?" Holmes said nothing for a moment, but turned to Lestrade, who had accompanied us. "Inspector, if you would ensure that the doors are secured, I would prefer no one leaves until we are quite finished." Reginald let out a sharp laugh. "Surely you don't think any of us is about to run away, Holmes? This has all become a dreadful farce." Holmes regarded him coolly. "A farce, Sir Reginald? I fear what I am about to reveal is anything but." He stepped forward and withdrew from his coat the golden locket Lestrade had found. Emily gasped when she saw it. "This belonged to your mother, did it not, Miss Ferro?" Holmes asked gently. She hesitated, then whispered, "Yes, I've seen it before. My mother wore it always." Holmes nodded. "And yet it was found this very morning, dropped by the watchtower, where your guardian, Lord Ferro, met his death." The room seemed to grow colder. Reginald stepped forward, sneering. "So what? You think she killed him?" Holmes turned to him sharply. "No, Sir Reginald, I believe you did." A deadly silence fell. Reginald's face flushed a dangerous red. "This is outrageous." But Holmes cut him off with a raised hand. "Spare us your indignation, sir. You see, I have been examining Lord Ferro's revised will, as well as the subtle language he employed. Language that suggests a secret long buried. Emily is not merely his ward, she is his daughter." Emily let out a small cry, covering her mouth in shock. Holmes pressed on, voice calm but firm. "That knowledge, when you discovered it, shattered all your expectations of inheriting the Ferro estate. You knew your uncle was preparing to officially recognize Emily and cut you out entirely. You had only one option left to preserve your position: to silence him before he could finalize the change. Reginald's mouth opened as if to reply, but no words came. His hand twitched at his side. Holmes's gaze sharpened. You met Lord Ferro at the Watchtower under the guise of a final discussion. Perhaps you brought the locket to remind him of his shame, of Emily's origin. Perhaps you tried to blackmail him into changing his mind. But when he refused, you struck. Reginald's composure broke for the briefest moment. A flicker of panic in his eyes. And Holmes did not miss it. You killed him, Holmes said quietly. And when Simmons began to suspect you, when he threatened to reveal what he knew, you tried to kill him as well. But Simmons was luckier than your uncle. You've no proof, Reginald spat, though there was now a tremor in his voice. No real proof, Holmes smiled thinly. I believe Simmons may soon wake and be able to give testimony. But even without him, there is more. He gestured to Lestrade, who opened a leather pouch and produced a bloodied cufflink, its ornate crest matching that of Sir Reginald's family ring. Found near the tower, Lestrade said grimly. Seems you dropped it, sir, in the struggle. Reginald's face drained of colour. Moreover, Holmes added, the mud on your boots when you returned home that night was of the same clay as that found by the watchtower. Unusual, as you claimed to have only visited the village that evening. Lies rarely cover all the traces, Sir Reginald. There was a moment of silence, broken only by Emily's soft sobs. Suddenly, with a roar of fury, Reginald lunged toward Holmes, pulling a small pistol from his coat pocket. Concealed until now. Stand back, he bellowed, eyes wild. No one is taking this from me. You think I'll let her steal my birthright? Never. Lestrade sprang forward, but Holmes remained, eerily calm, even as the gun was waved before him. Put it down, Reginald, Holmes said quietly. You cannot escape now. To run would only deepen your guilt. But Reginald, desperate and enraged, turned toward Emily, the pistol shaking in his hand. If I can't have it, no one will. Before he could fire, a sudden movement came from the doorway. Simmons, pale and weak but standing, his arm in a sling. No, Sir Reginald. Simmons croaked. Not again. Reginald spun around, stunned to see the man he thought silenced forever. That moment of distraction was enough. Lestrade surged forward, grappling the gun from Reginald's hand. It clattered to the floor. Harmless at last, the fight drained from Reginald. He sagged, his shoulders collapsing in defeat. Holmes stepped forward, his voice once again calm and measured. It is over, Sir Reginald. The truth has won out. Emily buried her face in her hands, weeping softly, while Lestrade signaled for his men waiting outside. Take him into custody, he said grimly. As they led Reginald away, Holmes turned to me, an unreadable look in his sharp grey eyes. As I said, Watson, when pride and greed are threatened, even the mask of family loyalty can fall away. Could only nod, still shaken by how close we had come to tragedy. Holmes sighed quietly, glancing at Emily as she struggled to compose herself. Come, Watson. Our work here is nearly done. But before it is, there are truths young Miss Ferro must hear and decisions that must be faced. As we left the drawing room behind, I realized that once again, Holmes had seen through the fog of deception to the dark heart of the mystery, and in doing so had prevented a final, desperate crime from claiming another life. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered within the grand halls of Ferro Manor. As Lestrade's men escorted Sir Reginald away, Emily sat silently by the window, her pale face turned toward the waning light. There was a deep sadness in her eyes. A woman betrayed not only by her guardian, but by a man she had trusted. Holmes stood by the mantelpiece, his hands clasped behind his back, gazing into the dying fire. The flicker of flames illuminated the sharp lines of his face, and I could see he was still piecing together the final threads of the mystery. Details only he, in his relentless way, could discern. I broke the silence. Holmes, I confess, though we know Reginald's guilt, I still do not fully see how you were able to predict his desperation, that he would attempt such a thing today. Holmes turned slowly, fixing me with his usual penetrating gaze. Ah, Watson, because desperation always follows discovery. Sir Reginald believed himself to be the heir of Ferro Manor. But when I found Lord Ferro's final unsigned will, which clearly named Emily as his rightful heir and daughter, I knew Reginald's world was about to collapse. The moment he realized I was aware of his crime, his only thought was to silence anyone who could confirm it, including Miss Ferro. I frowned, pacing slowly before the hearth. But what led you to be certain of Reginald's involvement, and not, say, Simmons, or even Miss Ferro herself? Holmes smiled faintly. Consider, Watson. Simmons was attacked precisely because he knew something dangerous. He had overheard a quarrel at the Watchtower. A quarrel not between Lord Ferro and some unknown assailant, but between Lord Ferro and Reginald. Simmons's injury was the final act of a man desperate to tie up loose ends. But more than that, there was a matter of small telling details. He turned to Emily, speaking now gently, as though to reassure her. Miss Ferro, your mother's locket, which was found near the tower, was not merely dropped by accident. I now believe that in the scuffle between Reginald and your father, Lord Ferro had it with him as a symbol of his intention to acknowledge you publicly. Perhaps he meant to give it to you that very night. But Reginald, fearing the consequences of your recognition as heir, confronted him. In the ensuing struggle, the locket fell. Emily looked up, her voice soft but steady. So my father truly meant to tell me. Holmes nodded. Indeed, I found among Lord Ferro's private papers letters he had written to your mother. Letters that prove beyond all doubt that you are his daughter. And the unsigned will was to ensure that no matter what, you would inherit the estate that is rightfully yours. Tears welled in Emily's eyes. He was going to do the right thing. Finally. Holmes's face softened, an unusual expression of empathy flashing in his sharp features. Yes, but alas, fate and Reginald's malice intervened too soon. I looked thoughtfully at Holmes. But Holmes, you said there were small details that gave Reginald away. Holmes turned to me, his eyes lighting up with that familiar glint of triumph. Indeed, Watson. First, the mud on his boots, as I mentioned before. No one could have picked up such distinctive clay unless they had been near the tower, which he denied. Second, the cufflink, which matched Reginald's family crest. And third, perhaps most telling, was a matter of timing. Reginald claimed to have been in the village at the time of Lord Ferro's death, but as I learned from speaking to the innkeeper, he was never seen that evening, despite claiming to have dined there. Holmes began to pace slowly, as though reciting for himself as much as for us. Lastly, Simmons's account, once he awoke, confirmed everything. He had overheard Reginald's bitter accusation that Lord Ferro had betrayed him for a bastard daughter, as Reginald called Miss Ferro in his anger, a damning piece of testimony. Emily's lips trembled, and now, what happens next? Holmes looked at her kindly. Justice, Miss Ferro. Reginald will face trial, and you will be free from his influence. But there are choices you must make about Ferro Manor, about your future. You are no longer merely a ward. You are now the rightful lady of this house. She gave a weak smile, though there was strength behind it. I will honor my father's wishes, and perhaps with time, bring peace back to this place. Holmes inclined his head. A wise decision. Turning to me, Holmes's tone shifted, more analytical once again. You see, Watson, a crime such as this is not merely solved with facts and evidence, though those are vital. It is solved when we understand the human heart, its greed, its fear, and sometimes its capacity for redemption. Quite so, Holmes, I said quietly, impressed as always by his insight. Holmes glanced toward the window, where the sun was finally breaking through the morning fog. Come, Watson, our task here is done. Lestrade will see to the formalities, and Miss Ferro has her future to face. As for us, I believe we are due for a well-earned return to Baker Street, and perhaps a moment's peace before the next summons to adventure. He allowed himself a faint, rare smile, and I knew that beneath his calm exterior, Holmes took no small satisfaction in having unraveled yet another intricate web of deceit. Chapter 15. The final gathering, the drawing-room of Ferro Manor was silent, save for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The heavy velvet curtains had been drawn back, allowing the pale light of dawn to seep into the room, casting long shadows across the polished floor. It was an atmosphere of tension and finality, one that signaled the conclusion of a great game of wits. At the center of it all stood Sherlock Holmes, his lean frame poised with quiet authority, his keen eyes scanning the gathered figures like a predator surveying its prey. Beside him, I took my usual place, notebook in hand, prepared to record the inevitable unraveling of deception. Seated stiffly in a high-backed chair, his face drained of its usual arrogance, was Sir Reginald, his wrists now bound, a silent but damning confirmation of his fate. Beside him, Inspector Lestrade stood with a weary but satisfied expression, arms crossed as he waited for Holmes to deliver the final blow. Across from them, Emily Ferro sat with an unreadable expression, her fingers twisting absent-mindedly around the locket Holmes had returned to her. To the side, old Mr. Simmons, the battered groundskeeper, leaned heavily on his cane. Though still weak from his injuries, he had insisted on being present for this moment of reckoning. The household staff huddled near the door, their eyes darting anxiously between Holmes and Reginald, As if afraid of what final revelation might yet come, Holmes let the silence stretch before speaking, his voice calm, precise, and utterly assured. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we stand now at the end of a most curious and intricate affair. An affair rooted in ambition, betrayal, and above all, greed. The crime that took place beneath the Moonlit Watchtower was no random act of violence, no crime of passion. It was, from the very start, a carefully planned murder." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Reginald shifted in his chair, but Holmes gave him no chance to speak. "Sir Reginald," he continued smoothly, "for years you believed yourself to be the sole heir of Ferro Manor, and you lived as such, until you learned that Lord Ferro had an illegitimate daughter, one who stood to inherit everything should her existence ever come to light." Emily drew a sharp breath, but Holmes pressed on, relentless. "You confronted Lord Ferro that night at the Watchtower. You demanded he deny his daughter, destroy the will, and ensure that your inheritance remained untouched. But your father refused. He had made his decision. He would finally acknowledge Emily as his rightful heir." Reginald's jaw clenched, but still he said nothing. "Your rage led to violence," Holmes continued. "In the struggle, your father fell, fatally injured. But you could not leave it at that. You had to ensure no one would suspect the truth, and so you attempted to stage his death as an accident, pushing his body from the tower. You believed the world would assume he had simply lost his footing on the rain-slicked stones. A tragic misstep. But you underestimated two things." He turned sharply, his gaze piercing into Reginald's. "First, you underestimated me, and second, you underestimated the sharp ears of your own groundskeeper." Simmons stiffened. All eyes turned to him. Holmes nodded in his direction. "Simmons overheard your argument. He heard you speak of a bastard daughter. He heard you threaten your father. And had you known he was lurking nearby, you would have silenced him sooner." Reginald let out a bitter laugh. "And yet you have no proof. No proof beyond the ramblings of an old man." Holmes's lips curled into a faint smile. "Oh, but I do." The room stilled. The cufflink found near the tower, bearing your family crest. The muddy footprints on the spiral staircase, proving you were there that night. The discrepancy in your alibi, when the innkeeper swore you were nowhere near the village when you claimed to be. And of course, the unsigned will, hidden within your father's study." Holmes turned to Lestrade. "And let us not forget the confession Simmons overheard. Though half-conscious at the time, he remembered your words clearly." Lestrade gave a sharp nod. More than enough for a conviction. Reginald's face had drained of all color. His hands clenched into fists, but there was no escape. No more lies to spin. Holmes straightened, his expression composed, his voice as smooth as ever. "And thus, Sir Reginald, the game is over. Your fate is sealed." Silence hung in the air, like a final solemn note. Emily's eyes were fixed on the locket in her hands. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "Then it's done." Holmes turned to her, his voice gentler now. "You are the rightful heir to Ferro Manor, Miss Ferro. You alone must decide what becomes of this house and of the future that now belongs to you." She looked up, something new in her expression. Strength, resolve. Then I shall honor my father's wishes. Holmes inclined his head in approval. A wise choice. With that he turned to me, a rare glint of satisfaction in his gaze. Come, Watson. I believe we have played our part in this matter. Lestrade will handle the rest. I gave one last glance at the assembled figures, the accused, the wronged, the bystanders to this tragic tale. Then, with a final nod to Miss Farrow, I followed Holmes out into the morning light. As we stepped into the waiting carriage, I could not help but marvel at the brilliance of my friend. And yet, as we rode back to Baker Street, Holmes seemed as indifferent as ever, as though the unraveling of yet another mystery had left him unsatisfied. "What troubles you, Holmes?" I asked at last. He leaned back, eyes closed, a small smirk tugging at his lips. "Troubles me? No, Watson. It is merely that the world is full of puzzles, some far more dangerous than this one. And I suspect that soon enough we shall find ourselves at the heart of yet another." I smiled to myself. As always, Sherlock Holmes was right. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down. The crime Sherlock Holmes stood before the gathered audience like a conductor ready to lead his orchestra. There was a certain energy in the air, an almost palpable anticipation, as all eyes fixed on the detective. Even Inspector Lestrade, leaning casually against the fireplace, gave Holmes his full attention. With hands clasped behind his back, Holmes began to pace, his gaze sharp and calculating. "Let me begin," he said quietly, "by reminding you all that the murder of Lord Farrow was, from the beginning, presented as an accident. A simple fall from the ancient watchtower on a stormy night. A tragedy, yes, but an accident. And yet, even as Watson and I stood at the base of that tower, certain details whispered to me that something was dreadfully wrong." He turned to Emily Farrow, his voice softening only slightly. "Miss Farrow, you recall you asked me why I lingered so long in your father's study?" She gave a small nod, her brow furrowed. "I was not searching aimlessly," Holmes said. "I was verifying a suspicion. You see, Lord Farrow had recently revised his will to name you as his rightful heir. But there was no trace of that final document, only the older version, favoring Sir Reginald. Why would a man, knowing he was aging and ill, neglect to ensure that such a critical paper was secured? The answer is simple. He did not neglect it. It was stolen the very night he died." A murmur ran through the room. Sir Reginald's jaw tightened. Holmes continued, voice steady as a metronome. "The second element that caught my attention was the muddy footprints found on the inner stairway of the tower. Unusual, for Lord Farrow was meticulous about cleanliness, and would not have ventured up those slick, treacherous stairs during a storm without reason. But someone else would, someone intending to confront him. Those prints, Sir Reginald, matched your boots perfectly, though you claimed to have been in the village at the time." Reginald's glare darkened, but he held his tongue. Holmes's eyes glinted. "Then there was the broken cufflink found at the tower's edge, an identical match to those you wear, bearing the Farrow family crest. You claimed to have lost it days earlier. But you see, I found its mate securely fastened on your sleeve, and the design is of a unique kind, not easily replaced." Lestrade let out a short grunt of approval. Holmes pressed on, weaving his narrative like a spider spinning silk. But perhaps most damning was what I learned from Mr. Simmons, the groundskeeper. Though gravely injured in what was presented as an accidental fall, Simmons managed to whisper to me a crucial memory, one that painted the full picture. He overheard an argument between Lord Ferrau and Sir Reginald in the Watchtower. Simmons heard Reginald accuse Lord Ferrau of betrayal, of planning to disinherit him. There was talk of a secret daughter. The very words were spoken in anger and desperation, moments before Lord Ferrau fell to his death. Holmes turned to Reginald now, his voice low but cutting. "You knew, didn't you? You learned of Emily's parentage, perhaps through the very lawyer who drafted the new will. You saw your claim to Ferrau Manor slipping away, and in a fit of rage, you confronted your father. The struggle ended fatally. Whether you pushed him in cold blood or struck him and let him fall, I may never fully know. But I know this. When the body was found, his hands were bruised and scraped, defensive wounds indicating that he fought for his life before being cast down to his death." The room was utterly still. Even the wind outside seemed to hush, as though the very air held its breath. "And let us not forget," Holmes added, his voice sharp again, "your desperate attempt to silence Mr. Simmons. You tampered with the Watchtower stairs after realizing that Simmons, perhaps unseen, had witnessed more than you could allow. You rigged the trap that nearly cost him his life, hoping to finish what you had started under the guise of another accident. A clever scheme, but one that failed because Simmons lived to tell his tale." Holmes paused, allowing his words to settle. Then he turned toward Watson and Lestrade, speaking now in a tone of calm authority. The crime, therefore, unfolded thus. Sir Reginald learned of Lord Ferrau's plan to leave the estate to his daughter, Miss Emily. Driven by greed and entitlement, he lured or followed his father to the Watchtower during the storm. They argued violently. In the end, Lord Ferrau was killed. To cover his crime, Reginald disposed of the will and manipulated the scene to suggest an accident. When Simmons proved a threat, Reginald acted again, attempting to eliminate the last witness to his guilt. Emily, pale and wide-eyed, finally found her voice. "You mean my father was murdered because of me?" Holmes turned to her gently. "Ash. Because of what you represented, Miss Ferrau. Justice, legitimacy, and your father's wish to set right an old wrong. You are blameless, though I know that knowledge brings little comfort." She swallowed, her eyes brimming with tears, but she nodded. Lestrade pushed away from the wall, stepping forward. "A fine job, Mr. Holmes. Seems we've got all we need, clear as day. Sir Reginald, you'll answer for this in court. No title or name's going to save you now." As Lestrade gave the signal to the constable waiting outside, Reginald rose, his defiance crumbling. For a brief moment, he looked as though he might speak. But faced with Holmes's cold, unwavering gaze, he merely hung his head in bitter defeat. Holmes let out a long breath and turned to me as the constable led Reginald away. "And so, Watson," he said quietly, "a man has lost his life, another his freedom, and a woman has gained a truth she never asked for. A tragic balance of justice, perhaps, but justice all the same." I stared at Holmes, marveling once again at the brilliant mind that had entangled such a web. Yet, even as I admired him, I could not help but feel the weight of the human cost this mystery carried. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The sky outside Ferro Manor had turned from pale grey to soft gold as the sun rose higher, casting long beams of light through the stately windows. The storm that had shrouded the manor in darkness for days had finally passed, but within its walls the echoes of tragedy still lingered. Sherlock Holmes stood by the window, hands behind his back, watching as the constables led Sir Reginald away in iron shackles. The man who had once carried himself with arrogance and entitlement now walked like a shadow of himself, his head bowed, his steps heavy with the knowledge of his fate. Lestrade lingered near the hearth, speaking quietly with one of the officers. The case was closed, the culprit in custody, and yet the air remained thick with unspoken questions and grief. Holmes turned to Emily Ferro, who sat quietly by the fire, her eyes fixed on the glowing embers. She held the locket her father had left her, the small silver pendant now a symbol of both her inheritance and her sorrow. "You are a brave woman, Miss Ferro," Holmes said gently, stepping closer. "Few could bear such revelations with such grace." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening but determined. "It is not bravery, Mr. Holmes. It is simply the truth. My father wished to make things right, and though his life was taken from him, I will see that his wishes are honored." Holmes gave a slight nod. "And Ferro Manor, it will remain in the family," she said firmly. "But I shall make changes, beginning with how my father's tenants are treated. There has been too much suffering hidden behind these walls. I intend to make amends." Holmes smiled faintly, a rare expression of approval. Then perhaps some good may yet come of this. Meanwhile, old Mr. Simmons was being assisted into a chair by the butler. Though pale and frail, he gave Holmes a grateful nod. "Thank ye, sir," Simmons rasped, his voice weak but sincere. "Had it not been for you, I'd not be here to see justice done." Holmes inclined his head. "It was your courage in speaking what you knew that made all the difference." From his place near the window, I watched as Holmes moved among those left behind, quietly offering them what comfort he could, though I knew well that such moments of compassion often weighed on him more than any battle of wits. He was a man who dealt in facts in reason, but even he could not ignore the human pain that lingered after the truth was uncovered. Lestrade approached Holmes at last, clearing his throat. "Well, Mr. Holmes, I must say you've done it again. I'll be making my report back to Scotland Yard, but I doubt anyone will question the case now. It's ironclad."